I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria automation.
In this video, we're going to see how to test blueprints using the REST API. And we're going to do that, as I'm sure you've already guessed, by using this REST request here called test blueprint. Before we take a look at that, let's quickly go pop over and look at our documentation. You'll recall we went into the documentation, so developer.vmware.com/APIs. We went specifically to the VRA blueprint API, which took us here. And what I want to explicitly point out here, let me collapse things a bit here. I told you in the previous video that these two categories of REST operations are super important for what we're trying to do. And understanding the difference between the operations that are in here versus the ones that are in here is super important. So let's take a look at these. I'm going to go into Blueprint like we did in the previous video, and I'd like to point out to you that all of these REST operations have endpoint URLs that say blueprint/API/blueprints. Compare that to the URLs in blueprint requests. These all say blueprint/API/blueprint-requests. You need to be able to spot when you're looking at this sort of URL versus this sort of URL. So does the URL say blueprints or does it say blueprint-requests? The operations in here are used for doing things like looking up blueprints or creating new blueprints or modifying blueprints or deleting blueprints. On the other hand, all the operations in here allow you to do things with the blueprints. For example, in this video, we're going to demonstrate how to test a blueprint. Now, if you go into the wrong section, if you go into blueprint, you're not going to see anything in here about doing a test because that's not how this is organized. Doing a test of a blueprint or a deployment of a blueprint works by using the operations in this guy here. So for example, we are going to do a REST request in which we're going to do a post blueprint API blueprint-requests. As you can see over here, this particular endpoint URL is going to create a blueprint request, which is a fancy way of saying do a deployment from a blueprint. And if we take a look at this here, it's got documentation about how this works, including the request body that you're going to supply needs to have information such as what we have listed here. So we can see an example of what the request body needs to look like. And additionally, if you want to dig down really deep and understand what all these different pieces of information are, if you click on Model, you can see more detailed information about exactly what those different pieces of information are, what type of data each one requires, and so forth. So I'll leave it to you to, on your own time, to look at this API documentation in more detail. But what I want to do is jump back over here to Postman and point out to you that this REST request here, test blueprint, is one of those ones. We can spot it right here in this portion of the URL. This is one of the ones that's going to do something with a blueprint.
VMware instructors are the best in the world. They have years and years of experience. They know how to find the answer. Take a class. Take a class with one of our VMware certified instructors.
Well, which blueprint? Looking at the endpoint URL, I don't see anything about a blueprint or a blueprint ID or a blueprint name. So how does it know which blueprint we want to do the deployment on. We know that we want to do a deployment. So post is going to create something new. It's going to create a deployment. And as we just saw in the API documentation, blueprint API blueprint-requests, when you do a post, is going to create a new deployment. But where does it say which blueprint we want to use? Well, the answer, if you're looking a few moments ago, is actually here in the API documentation. You need to say blueprint ID and then the ID of the blueprint that you want to use. Now, you can find out information about all these here in the API documentation, but again, I want to show you. So back to good old Postman. In Postman, for this REST request, let's look at the body. For the body here, I have passed in various pieces of information, such as the blueprint ID. Through this variable, I'm going to specify which blueprint I want to do the deployment from. Each time I do deployment, each deployment gets a name, so I'm going to specify the name here. Each time I do a deployment, I can specify a description, and I can do all sorts of other things, but notice, if you will, here on line number 10, this property called simulate. If you say simulate : true, like we're doing in this example, that is going to cause the blueprint to be tested or validated. On the other hand, if you change this to false, which we're going to see occurring when we look at this next request, simulate : false means I don't want to test this blueprint. I don't want to validate it. I want to use it to actually do a deployment. So simulate : true means do a test. Simulate : false means do an actual deployment. As you'll recall, I had you import 3 different blueprints. Right now, what I want to do is make certain that whatever this blueprint ID Postman variable set to, I want to make certain that it's pointing to the blueprint that I actually intend to use right now. So I'm going to go over to our environment. I'm going to go to the VVork environment, and I'm going to take a look at the variable called blueprint ID. So blueprint ID, in this case, ends in 5613. And either using the REST API, or I'm going to do this manually, I'm going to go take a look at the blueprint that I intend to use, which is this one here called CentOS. So VVork-CentOS is the blueprint I want to use. I'm going to click on that blueprint, and the tail end of this URL is the blueprint ID. And you'll notice this one ends in 5613, which is in fact what we just saw the Postman variable set to. So I have confirmed that the blueprint_ID Postman variable is set to the blueprint ID for this blueprint, because this is the blueprint I want to use. By the way, when you're looking up blueprint IDs manually, or for that matter, if you're looking up project IDs or Cloud Zone IDs, when you look up those IDs, if you just go to the item itself, for example, I went to this particular blueprint, look at the URL and go from right to left till you hit the rightmost %2F. Everything after that rightmost %2F is the ID. In this case, this is the ID of our blueprint that we want to use. Okay, so I have double checked that we have the correct blueprint ID in this Postman variable. So let's actually click the send button and see what happens. All right, as always, we check the status code. We got a 200 series code, but notice this time it's not 200, it's 202. But that's in the 200 series, which means good. 202 means our request to do the test has been accepted. We can see other information here, such as the ID of the request. We can see when it was created. We can see who did it. We can see the organization ID and the project ID and the project name associated with this test, and so forth. But notice if we scroll down here, we can see status is started. That's obviously a key piece of information. Now, if we continue to stare at the screen here, this is not going to update. This is going to say status : started for the next bazillion years. When you do a test, or for that matter, when you do a deployment, what you see here is the response body for a request that has been kicked off asynchronously. So the request, in this case, the test of the blueprint, is running in the background over on the VRA server. If you want to see what's going on with that background job, if you want to see what's going on with the test, you need to know about something called let's see if we can find it here, the requestTrackerId. So we just kicked off a request asynchronously, a request to do a test. And if we want to follow up on that request, we need to know the ID, which we can see right here. Now, if we want to, we can copy and paste this into the next request. The next request I'm going to show you is going to actually find out what's going on with this request. But I have, as in so many other REST requests, I've taken a few additional steps here on the test tab for this request. You'll notice that I'm saving the requestTrackerId into this postman variable. I'm also saving the deployment ID. We'll talk about deployment ID later on, but the thing you need to know about first is requestTrackerId. That requestTrackerId is going to enable you to see what's going on with the test. Again, just to prove the point, this still says status started, and it will continue to say status started. We need to know how to go look up the results of the request that we submitted. So let's go to collections, and we're going to skip deploy blueprint for right now. I promise we'll look at that in the next video. We're going to go to this next REST request called get status of blueprint request, and notice in the URL what it needs. So this URL is going to get information about a blueprint request. In this case, the blueprint request was a test, or it could have been a deployment. In this case, it's a test. And since we've got that requestTrackerId, it's going to give us information about what's going on with that test. Is the test done? If so, did it succeed? If it's done, maybe it failed, or maybe it's not done yet. Maybe it's still in process. To find out what's going on with that request, we'll click send. So when we click send, we take a look at the status code for the usual reason, and status 200, just to be real clear here, status 200 does not mean anything about the status of the actual request. This is the status of our REST request. It's not the status of the VRA request. If you want to know what VRA thinks about this particular test blueprint request, if you go scrolling down, in this case to line 24, status finished is telling us what VRA says about this request that we kicked off asynchronously. So in this case here it says finished, which means it's done doing the test. And since it doesn't say failed, that means that this request succeeded. Not just that the request succeeded, it means that the test, the validation succeeded. On the other hand, if it said status : failed, that means we're done doing the test and bad news, the test failed. And if you want to, you can see more information. But this is our first instance where we're encountering this business of something called the requestTrackerId. So keep an eye out for it in subsequent REST operations that we're going to be performing. In particular, you're going to see that requestTrackerId business show up again in the next video when we talk about how to deploy from a blueprint.
Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.